So, may I please request the panelists and the moderator to come on the dais? Uh, Mr. Bipul Chatterjee, Executive Director, CUTS International. Mr. Sugeeswara Senadhira, Director, Research and International Media, Presidential Secretariat, Sri Lanka. Ms. Ellen L. Frost, Senior Advisor, East-West Center, Washington, D.C. Mr. Julian Michael Bevis, Senior Director, Group Relations, South Asia, Maersk Line India Private Limited. Mr. Vishal Dashora, Associate Director, PwC India. And Mr. Tapas Paul, Lead Environmental Specialist, the World Bank Group India Office. Thank you to all the panelists. May I please now request Bipul sir to take over the session.
Thank you, Devalina. This session is about maritime and inland waterways connectivity. And as you know, when we talk about this region, BBI in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, and Sri Lanka, Eastern South Asia, and the southern part of this region, both maritime connectivity and inland waterways connectivity, they are very, very important. If I look at the history, and by history I mean not just the recent history, but also what I mean is from our ancient time, from our medieval time, as well as the modern history. Maritime connectivity or waterways connectivity, whether it is through ocean or through rivers, that used to be the most important avenue of connectivity in this region. And not just in this region, but I think all over the world. But somehow, due to the accident of history, I would say the political history, that has got, at least in our part of the world, got very hugely affected, I would say. We got disconnected in a sense, in a large sense. For example, if I look at the northeast of India in particular, before the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, I understand, and there is data there on this point, that northeast of India used to be one of the most prosperous regions of our country. And the reasons being that they are well connected through rivers, and then to the ocean, to Bay of Bengal, and then to Indian Ocean, and then Pacific Ocean. And then that connectivity helped them to do a lot of business. There are three major businesses: timber, tea, as well as oil, and of course other products. That got disconnected as a result of the creation of new political boundaries. Now, in order to revive that, the good thing is that it's being revived. There are a number of initiatives which we see for the betterment of maritime connectivity, inland waterways connectivity in our region. For example, there is this coastal shipping agreement between India and Bangladesh. There is huge investment which is going on for the development of inland waterways, both in India as well as in Bangladesh. Bhutan is showing interest to have an agreement with Bangladesh, and they cannot have that agreement with Bangladesh unless India is also involved for multimodal transport connectivity between Bhutan and Bangladesh, with India in between, through transit through India. There are port developments which are taking place in Sri Lanka. Nepal is also showing interest in having riverine connectivity, particularly Kochi and Ganges River, with India for river transport, of cargo transport through rivers. So all these positive things are happening. So what we need to do is to see how various initiatives which are happening in the region, how can they be better aligned with each other, number one. Number two is what are the further investment opportunities that we have I understand that the Inland Waterways Authority of India is, of course, they are making huge investment all over the country, particularly in the eastern part of the region, including in northeastern part of the region. And the Bangladesh Inland Water Transport Authority, they are coming out with a plan. The draft plan is there for 10 years. And when I look at that plan, I was not shocked, but I was very optimistic in the sense that if it can be implemented properly, then it can change the region forever for prosperity. And that requires huge amount of investment. So how are we going to have that? And this flows very well from the previous session where we had public-private partnerships and other various avenues of investment, private investment, which is already happening. I know that American companies and other companies, they are investing in manufacturing modern dredgers. The dredging is going to be very important for these initiatives to be successful. So, with this note, I think we have an excellent panel. We have a gentleman from Sri Lanka, Sugeeswara, Senadhira. Till recently, he was associated to the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Colombo. Now he is at the Presidential Secretariat in the government of Sri Lanka. We have Ellen Frost from East-West Center, our partner in these initiatives and many other initiatives. We have Julian Bevis from Maersk line, the world's largest shipping line, and they have a lot of business in this region, and that business is expanding. So we are going to hear from Julian the private sector perspective on this issue. We have Mr. Tapas from World Bank, who has been working on this subject, particularly the Sundarbans program, which he is leading. And he is also very keen to see how river cruise through inland waterways and involving coastal shipping as well can be revived in this region, not just for cargo, but river cruise for passenger transport and leisure tourism and things like that. Then we have Vishal from PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Unfortunately, Mr. Shukla from Inland Waterways Authority of India, he could not come because there is another very important engagement which has come, but we are grateful to Vishal to spare his time and to come and talk to us on this very important subject. So, instead of going one by one, what I propose to do is to make it a little more interactive so that we can come out with some concrete outcomes of this from this session. So my first question to all of you, particularly to Mr. Senadhira, is that we see that there are a number of port developments which are taking place in Sri Lanka. We have Colombo port, we have Hambantota port, we have other ports which are coming up. And this is also true for Bangladesh. Maybe Vishal and Mr. Paul can enlighten us on this point, this deep sea port development which are taking place in Bangladesh and India. So how do you see that? How viable they are, number one, and how effectively they are going to reduce the transportation time, cost of doing trade between these countries, the developments of all these new ports. So I'll start with maritime connectivity. That's number one. Number two is how these new ports and of course the existing ports, how they are going to help all these countries to enhance their maritime trade with East Asian countries, with Southeast Asian countries, and the larger Indo-Pacific region, Indian Ocean as well as in Pacific countries in the Pacific region. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad he asked me about the maritime connectivity rather than the internal waters, because coming from an island nation, we have few rivers, but we hardly use them for transportation, except for perhaps timber, bamboo trees, like in ancient days we still carry in our river system. When it comes to maritime connectivity, as you know, Sri Lanka is situated very strategically situated, very close to one of the most important international sea lanes. So our intention is to become a maritime hub of the Indian Ocean. For that, we have been dreaming, planning for years, and we initiated it, as Tilan said this morning, that our Port of Colombo started with a single terminal and with a limited number of container handling facilities, but it expanded into a massive operation, and it became bigger than any of the Indian ports in no time. And currently we are handling 2.5 TEUs per annum. That is, we have 4 terminals there. I'll go into the controversial East Terminal later, but before that I would like to talk about something you didn't discuss this morning. I was a bit surprised, you see, about the Chinese, when you talk about the connectivity, Belt and Road Initiative of China was not discussed. Anyway, before that, I'll just mention about our interest in the Indian Ocean being increasingly defined as the ocean of future. The linkages between India and Pacific Ocean are envisaged to create a maritime superhighway that can bring prosperity all for. That's our vision. The Indian Ocean has become another area of global geopolitics. Nevertheless, what others see as competitiveness, the host countries see as complementary. Sri Lanka aims to become connectivity hub in the heart of Indian Ocean. In other words, the country has to use the strategic location and leverage on our connectivity to become the hub of Indian Ocean. Several of these advanced infrastructure projects, including the Hambantota Port and the Mattala Airport, the expansion of Colombo Port, establishment of Southern Expressway, have been carried out for this purpose. Furthermore, the development of the 3 major ports and the 2 international airports, which are all connected by road and rail to the proposed, not proposed now, those are in operation, the economic zones. Sri Lanka is confident that these initiatives will transform it into a shipping, aviation and logistic hub. At the same time, Sri Lanka is strengthening financial connectivity by establishing an offshore financial center in the port city, which is the real estate development project commenced under the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Now I come to that. The Belt and Road Initiative will provide the much needed connectivity to the Indian Ocean required for rapid economic and social development. As people said, see, the international connectivity, when it comes to that, we were talking about the internal connectivity, internal waterways connectivity and the subcontinent the trade. For that, you see, 80% of our container, we handle containers in Colombo and soon we'll be handling them in Hambantota too. All these, 80% of them are for the Indian subcontinent, and large bulk of nearly 70% of them are for India, Indian ports, because they find it rather economical to drop the stuff by heavy container ships in Colombo, Hambantota, and then transport them by smaller ships to Indian harbors. So this, it is in Sri Lanka's interest to use this to our advantage. Expansion of Colombo Harbour, or rather Colombo Port, see, we have started the JCT project, as Tilan explained this morning, that is with the JICA assistance. And subsequently, we have given, or rather went into a joint venture with China for the second terminal of the port. Now we do have 2 more. One is the eastern terminal, which Sri Lanka would like to retain because the country feels that they need at least 1 terminal for their own use in case they decided to go in for further activities on trade on its own, rather than going in for a joint venture or partnership with others. We do have another one, the Western Terminal, which is yet to be developed. It might take, now that is what we offered. You see, the last year's 2017 agreement with India clearly states that we will give one of the terminals in Colombo Port to India for a joint venture with India and Japan, if possible. So that one, see, we don't have any hesitation in offering it to India. The thing is, India is determined to go in for a partnership on Eastern Terminal development because the Eastern Terminal is already in operation. They find it more convenient. But we would rather like to have going in for a joint venture with India for the Western Terminal. It might take few years for it to be fully operational, but that will suit the both parties. We understand that under the current political and sensitivities, it may not be possible for us to give East Terminal because in Sri Lanka, we have two, I'll go into a little bit of politics to explain this. Because we have a partnership government we had until last week. It was the two parties, United Nations Party and Sri Lanka Freedom Party. The UNP is pro-Western, pro-capitalist, pro-economic, open economy. Their policies are such. Whereas the SLF is the traditional Sri Lanka Freedom Party is more nationalistic party which believes in strengthening national entrepreneurs and national economy, reduce imports, increase exports on our own, go in for agriculture-based economy, and so on and so forth. So because of that, with that, currently now with SLFP-led government is in form again, it is rather unlikely that East Terminal could be given to any international party. So that's where it stands right now.
Anything else you want to add? Okay, let me come to Ellen. Since you have done a lot of work in the political aspects of maritime connectivity, so how do you see how this game is being played in this region? Game which in the sense that which is being played in the Bay of Bengal region, including Myanmar, is very important in that game. Then we have Malacca Strait, which is, I think, one of the most important stretch of maritime connectivity. Then we have this important sea line, which is going just about, if I'm correct, is 12 nautical miles away from Colombo, within 12 nautical miles of Colombo port. So this particular stretch in the Bay of Bengal and just from there to the Indian Ocean is very, very important. And given the various political developments which are taking place in this region, and there are extra-regional players who are also involved in it. So how do you see, how it is going to affect maritime connectivity in future? That's number one. And number two, that what would be the role of, perhaps that is, number two is more important more relevant for Julian, is the development of all these deep sea ports. Bangladesh is coming out with 2 or 3, India is coming out with a number of them. So how are they going to affect the future business of shipping lines and other business in this region? So over to you, Ellen, first.
Well, thank you very much, Bipul. The formal and informal dialogues that we're having here is exactly the purpose for which the East-West Center was established. So I want to thank you for your role in all of this. There's a new report out from the RAND Corporation that begins with a sentence: why is demand for better maintained transportation and water infrastructure and new investment not being met under current policies, funding, and market conditions? You would think that that question was addressed to South Asia, but in fact the subject of the report is the United States. So I want to say at the outset, before addressing your questions, that I'm here in the spirit of learning, and I've learned a great deal. You asked about the strategic environment and the rapid changes in it. That is one of the 3 reasons why I think this subject is particularly urgent and more urgent by the day. The other 2 reasons are pretty obvious: climate change and the need to incorporate climate change into all of our maritime and river projects. Second, the technology is changing very fast, and there's a danger that South Asia will be left even further behind. And the third is the strategic environment. So I will say something about that. Um, we have gone through a kind of remapping exercise. The term Indo-Pacific is now the standard term. The Pacific Command is now the Indo-Pacific Command, and obviously all of that signals the importance of India and its turn outward after sort of the Nehru years of inward-looking protectionism and strict neutrality. India is still neutral, don't get me wrong. I won't wade into that particular thing, but the point is that India has developed important strategic relationships through the Quad and bilaterally. I think what's striking about the climate, and my colleague here referred to the Belt and Road Initiative, is the dramatic increase in economic statecraft, by which I mean the use of economic instruments to promote influence and, in some cases, foreign policy outcomes. We see that most dramatically, but not exclusively, in China's Belt and Road Initiative and the AIIB and some of the other things that China has sponsored. And officially, everybody loves everybody, don't get me wrong, and officially these are win-win opportunities, which they clearly are, but at the same time there's an underlying rivalry that makes this region strategically more important. The country that I want to highlight for just a minute is Japan. I think it's easy to underestimate Japan. They have a low-key style, they fly under the radar, but Japan has been very, very active in economic statecraft in the region. The Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, PQI, quality infrastructure, is intended to draw a contrast between Japan's high standards and the criticisms made of Chinese projects that they are sometimes sloppy construction or environmentally damaging or whatever. So again, that's that sort of underlying rivalry. Japan has been instrumental in merging the major two accounts of the Asian Development Bank, giving the ADB a great deal more leverage to lend. And as we know, the ADB has invested enormous resources in PPPs. There's a separate office there. It's part of their annual report. The World Bank has a private participation in infrastructure PPI database. So the multilateral institutions are behind what's going on, but not in a position, obviously, to do things that violate what the government wants. So just in this last week, we've seen Xi Jinping and Abe meeting together and deciding to collaborate on some 50 infrastructure projects. Hard to imagine how, given the differences, collaboration can take place, but it could be hospitals on the one hand, doctors on the other, roads on the one hand, bridges on the other. We don't know, but that's politically very significant. Abe personally has been very active as a strategic player in this whole region. Also within this week, we had Prime Minister Modi. In both meetings, there's a great deal of attention on infrastructure. So the other difference besides the use of economic statecraft is the personal involvement at the particular importance. So we'll come back to this when maybe we'll talk about where we go from here. But it's one of the clear implications is that whatever strategic planning is going forward, and it should absolutely involve the private sector from the beginning, whatever's going forward has to take into account the strategic significance of this region.
Thank you, Ellen. I would underline 2 points from what you said just now. One is economic statecraft. I think that's very, very important, and that always it evolves. Yeah, and nowadays we are seeing a new kind of economic statecraft, and we don't yet know what would be the consequences, what would be the implications, what it's going to lead to us. Second is about private sector involvement. I think one of the reasons why connectivity is not that good in our part of the region, it used to be very good. I mean, if I look at the sea trade, say between eastern part and southern part of India and to Southeast Asian countries, and it was so nicely aligned with the blow of wind, southwest monsoon and things like that. and it was driven entirely by the private sector at that point of time. The kingdoms, whether it was Chinese kingdoms or Indian kingdoms or other in the Indochina region, they were in Japan, those kingdoms, they encouraged private sector to do it. They didn't do it themselves. Whereas, since 1950s, or what we have seen is that it's mostly driven by the government. It's government-to-government initiatives. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why connectivity is not that good in our part of the world. And now we have realized that private sector plays a very, very important role, and unless we involve private sector fully, even at the level of negotiations, even at the level of the drafting of agreements, these agreements are going to be only on paper, primarily. And the implementation will always be problematic. So with that, let me come to Julian. How do you see all these new developments which are taking place? And I would particularly like to underline two developments and how it is going to affect your business. Your means the kind of sector that you are in. One is the opening of the Arctic route. I know that at least in the short run it may not be that viable, but that option is there. Number two, the opening of, which is going, again, is going to take some time, the CPEC, and this alternate route to access particularly oil from the Middle East region. I understand 75% of China's oil requirement, and also Japan's, they come from that shipping line, shipping route, which is within 12 nautical miles of Colombo. But with the opening up of CPEC, another route is possible. And the kind of things which are developing in Hormuz Strait at the moment, we don't yet know what kind of implications it will have in the very near future, maybe next week. So, A, all these deep sea ports which are coming up in the eastern part of the region, and B, this political development, how it is going to affect the maritime connectivity overall in this region and beyond in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the business that you are in. And thirdly, how do you see the future of private sector engagement with all these primarily government-led initiatives? So over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing to say is thank you to CUTS and one of the other organizations who've put this conference together. And I'm not just being polite, I'm trying to make a general point, and that is in reinforcement of the point that's already been touched on, namely the involvement of the private sector in these discussions. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that the private sector has all the answers, certainly not. But it does strike me that these issues, and your question is eloquent testimony to that, these issues are very complicated, and it requires the efforts of everybody to deal with them, whether it's government, whether it's the private sector, whether it's think tanks, whether it's regulators, doesn't matter. Between all of us, we have to tackle these things, and I think that an event like this is very constructive in that regard. I think the logistics industry, in the broadest sense, frankly, is very poor at expressing a collective view and engaging in a broad debate in the way that should be done. And I don't think government's terribly clever, or governments are terribly clever in this part of the world in engaging with the private sector in the way that I think they should. It's undoubtedly getting better. I've had the privilege of living and working in South Asia over the last 22 years, and now logistics, thank heavens, is on the agenda of government. When I first came here, people couldn't even spell the word, let alone know what it meant. And that's a serious point, because if these issues are not on the policy agenda of government, then it just ain't going to happen. Now, I know that's a motherhood statement, a statement of the obvious, but it really is the case. I came here, as I said, 22 years ago. We talked about logistics, and people looked blank. So an event like this is important in that regard, in getting it on the agenda. I'd like to go back to some of the things the gentleman from Sri Lanka said about port development there. There are one or two things which perhaps offline we might talk about separately. But I think what you said underlines a very important point, and that is that there needs to be alignment between infrastructure plans in the sense of the physical infrastructure, government policy, and the regulatory environment which surrounds them. Sri Lanka's a good example of all of this, because there's a lot of rhetoric about let's make this the maritime hub, but there are policy details that lie behind all that which make that well nigh impossible. And those need to be addressed. Now, I do realize that the current political circumstances in that country, very sadly, are perhaps a little unhelpful, but hopefully we'll get over that quite quickly. But when we do, we need to address that lack of alignment. We could talk separately at great length about that, but there's a lot of work to do there. You asked the question about the Arctic route. It was one of our ships that actually hit the news recently by going through the Arctic route with a load of containers. I think that's a really important thing for the industry to have done, in the sense that it demonstrates it can be done and done safely, and that's really important. We've got to take care of the environment as much as anything, as well as blazing new trails. But I don't think it's going to work on a long-term basis, because supply chains want regularity, and regularity won't happen when you can only work for 3 or 4 months of the year. Heaven help us, climate change may make that window longer. If it does, then I think between all of us we'll have bigger issues to deal with. So I don't see a major diversion of cargo, but I do see continuing interest in that, for the simple reason that people always look, and should always look, for alternatives. Closer to home, you asked the question about lots of new ports being developed. It's certainly true that there's a lot of talk about new ports being developed, and in 1 or 2 places there are such things. I think we, again, need to look carefully at the difference between the rhetoric and what's actually happening on the ground, because in some cases there is a significant divergence, which is unfortunate. It is not for nothing that logistics costs in India, at any rate, are probably double those of their competitors. And one of the reasons is that the rhetoric's good, but the delivery is much less good. A function of that issue is this slightly overworked expression, connectivity. We still, and policymakers still, talk in terms of building a port, and they think with their eyes sparkling of new cranes and new railway lines and all the rest of it. What they forget is that logistics now is a joined-up game. If you build a river terminal, or you talk about river transport, or you build a port, or an airport for that matter, you've got to build the bits and pieces of infrastructure at either end that will deliver the cargo, or the people, or the air freight, or whatever it is, to and from the port. If you don't have that, then you might just as well not build that port. And again, one has to take into account the infrastructure in legal and regulatory terms that exist around that. So many times we see people build a port, and we don't see people taking full account of the way in which, for example, that port is going to operate. So it's great that there's lots of focus on this now, and it's great that there's lots of activity, but we must make sure that we look at the full deck of cards and not just one bit of it. I could go on for hours about this, but I think I'll shut up and let other people speak.
I'll come back to you, Julian. Essentially, what you said is that, well, the glass is still half full. I mean, earlier it was more or less empty as far as logistics sector was concerned. But it's not, the point is not about whether the glass is half full or not. Point is more about what is the shape of the glass, size of the glass, and what it contains, right? And that will require a number of alignments. It's just not one alignment. A multi-alignment approach is needed. And I'll come back to this point. But before I do that, I understand that the World Bank is doing a lot of work. There's huge investment which World Bank is making both in India, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in other countries. And there are environmental implications of all this investment which World Bank is doing. Of course, there are social implications as well. So how are you dealing with that? I mean, are you doing the sustainability impact assessment before taking those investment decisions? By sustainability impact assessment, I mean both economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, as well as social sustainability of this investment. That's number one. Number two is, how do you see the alignment between maritime connectivity? In this case, I'm very specific, the coastal shipping agreement between India and Bangladesh, for example, and the inland waterways cooperation between these two countries in particular. How can they be joined? The dots can be joined to make them, both of them, more effective, more useful for enhancing the logistic development, the logistic sector of these countries, to make them more aligned with the multimodal connectivity of these countries. So what do you?
Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this session. But no thank you for asking me questions about environment, which will make me immensely unpopular. So I will come to that answering that question a little later. But let me take a bit of take on this integration of coastal and inland waterway shipping. Now, you have rightly pointed out it some years ago, or many years ago, this region had the then, if not best, good quality river and coastal transport. So the last year that people went from Delhi to Singapore on steamer was 1931. So, so until then it was quite okay. Delhi to Dhaka was a regular service until 1913. And slowly we lost all of that. Now, talking about this earlier experience of Delhi to Singapore is important because at that point of time, there was no artificial distinction between inland shipping and coastal shipping. And to my belief, that integration needs to be resurrected because there is no way that we can actually get the full benefit of all this alternative mode of transport unless we can actually think in an integrated manner about the transport. And that integration, when we talk about, when Julian talked about logistics, so we are actually talking about logistics, which is this integrated logistics plan. And in that, this particular mode of transport or two different modes of transport or multimodal modes are all part of that integrated whole. Now, unfortunately, in our country, our countries, Bangladesh, India in particular, but applies to probably Sri Lanka too, is that we are very good in segmenting things and get immersed in that segment and never able to swim away from that segment. So Inland Waterway Authority of India historically talked about inland shipping. Similarly in Bangladesh, they never talked about shipping because they thought it's not their turf. And when the opportunity is now with them, then it's very difficult because we have not probably do not have the capacity to think from the basics. So that's very important, logistics, the entire logistics industry and their participation in this business, and shipping is only part of it, inland or coastal. Now, the second issue is that why a strategic assessment of these have not been done, whether it is one belt, one road, or north-south corridor, or any other CPSE, or this connectivity through inland shipping, because as Julian said, lots of things are full of rhetoric. The glass size is huge. The glass is filled up with dreams and only a bit of pebbles of infrastructure. So these are aspirational infrastructure. Now, and normally what would happen is that infrastructure should follow demand. Now, here is the case where infrastructure is supposed to generate demand. The demand is not necessarily clearly understood. And it's not only at the government level. I think the private sector is also not very aspirational. So one example that we can talk about, one example, and then can be thousands of these. Between India and Bangladesh, the general discussion is that the trade imbalance. Now, although India-Bangladesh trade is increasing at a high rate for 11% per year for last 10 years, but the corollary is that the import from India is 89 or 90%, export to India is 10%. And now we think about containerization and using inland waterway coastal shipping to be part of that trade, believing that that's the way the trade will go on and whether it's beneficial to both countries or not. Now, I would think that private sector in Bangladesh, for example, in timber industry, furniture, India has a big time problem in furniture industry. India imports about $15 billion worth of timber every year, because India does not have timber for itself. Now, Bangladesh has supply of timber, and furniture market in India is not very high. India's furniture market is actually non-existent. Bangladesh has a thriving furniture market. All of its furniture market export is aimed towards Europe. They have never thought about India. Now, if the furniture export to India, the private sector can actually become aspirational. That's an added demand which can then be part of the inland waterway or coastal shipping process. Now, another thing which is about India-Bangladesh is that it's not about India and Bangladesh. It's about Nepal, Bhutan, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, China, and others. Now, just taking that example forward, timber supply to India. How much is coming from Myanmar and how much is expected to come from Myanmar over a period of time, and why Bangladesh shipping will not play a role in that. That's not being discussed. That's not in the agenda. So I think when the government has started becoming a little bit of aspirational, I think it's our job to also see that, I mean, whether we can help the private sector also to become a bit aspirational. Now, to answer your first question, yes, when we intervene in a project, when we invest in a project or part finance a project, we certainly do the environmental assessments, both strategic and local environmental assessment to look at the values, and anything which is seen to be harmful will not go through. So taking cue of that, I would think that why integration is important between coastal, inland, and the entire logistics chain is also to avoid environmental impacts. For example, there is no reason for all the cargo movement to happen between India and Bangladesh through the Sundarbans only. And given that some 27% of the cargo is actually petroleum, POL, So that's very hazardous for Sundarban. So we need to think about integrate in an integrated manner. Secondly, an aspirational goal is that if you want to decarbonize the coastal shipping sector, it cannot be done without decarbonizing the inland shipping sector. So those two together actually should work together to decarbonize.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Paul. I think you made a number of important points. The first is that, at least in this case, as you have said with examples, that supply doesn't create its own demand. So you have to understand that before supplying all these things, how we can align them with the possible demand which we can generate. I mean, there is no point in having a nice waterways, whether it is inland or coastal or maritime, that's a different matter. And then doesn't align it with possible goods which can be traded through that waterways. We have to keep all these things in mind, and therefore, I would again underline the point, the word alignment. It's not just the alignment of various modes of connectivity, but also how those modes of connectivity, here we are talking about waterways, can be aligned with the production centers. For example, in Bangladesh, as we understand, there are 100 special economic zones are coming up. Some of them are already in the process, under construction. So how those economic zones can be better aligned with various, in particular, waterways connectivity that they have and they are being revived, and how they can be put better use of such routes, particularly waterway routes. So we have representative from, not from private sector, but I understand that PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, they do a lot of work with the private sector as well as with the government sector. So it's great that you are here, and I would like to ask you a couple of questions. One is that, do you see that there is still a difference in the thinking of the government and the private sector? The kind of discussion that we are just now having, number one. And number two, what would be the possibility, and what is the possibility of more and more private sector investment in this sector, particularly in these countries?
So, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this interesting conference wherein stakeholders from different status of the business and politics and government and various organizations are here to discuss matters which are of importance to all of us, all the stakeholders. Mr. Shukla couldn't attend this event, member traffic from IWI, he had another engagement. So he asked me to come and express our views on his behalf. We as PwC are working with IWI as their project management consultants, helping them develop this entire waterways infrastructure which is in attention right now, right from the ministry. So, I mean, specifically addressing your questions, I would like to just take a couple of minutes to touch upon various interesting points mentioned by the respectable delegates present here. We spoke about climate change. We spoke about private sector investment in PPP mode. We also spoke about the integration of coastal and waterways mode for the promotion of trade. So, I mean, considering all the 3-4 aspects that have been touched upon here, I would say inland waterways is in a very sweet spot right now in terms of the kind of work which has been going on and the kind of potential which is being seen given the implementation of which this works happen with the time. In terms of maritime and regional connectivity, you must have heard and read a lot about the development which is being going on River Ganga with the technical and financial assistance of World Bank. The entire stretch from Haldia to Varanasi is being developed for round-the-day navigation of cargo through barges. That is one. Even for the passenger cruise also, certain policies are being developed so that the waterways can be used for that purpose. On the Ganga River itself, we are developing 3 multimodal terminals, which will benefit the trade within India. Also, they will have a strong role to play in giving connectivity to Nepal, Mount Kaugum, which is coming from Haldia and Calcutta right now, especially the containerized cargo. With Bangladesh, we already have a very good relationship through the Waterways Treaty that is in place. In the last week, there was a secretarial meeting, secretary from Bangladesh and from India, to further promote trade, develop, add on to the policy which already exists so that the trade gets promoted. There were certain SOPs which were finalized and signed for the movement of cruise vessels also between India and Bangladesh. So, a lot of things are happening on the ground at the policy level and also at the infrastructure level, which are driven by the policy. When you ask this question to me, that whether the private sector and the government are looking at the development and the infrastructure development in the same manner, my answer would be yes, a strong yes. In fact, just to give you a reference from yesterday, I was with the Ministry of Commerce yesterday, and the way they have been engaging private sector, both the consumer side and the service provider side, and also different bodies, nodal bodies within the infrastructure sector, whether it is railways, road, shipping and waterways, to develop a national logistics action plan, which is with an idea that whatever is being invested and thought upon in terms of policies, it is synchronized with each other. Few points that we already came across in the discussion. So even the private sector is enthused by this kind of a thought process and the policy work which the government is showing. So I would say yes, definitely, both private sector and government are growth oriented towards trade promotion, bringing down cost of logistics. And in that direction, inland waterways is a very strong contender of the transportation mode, which can bring down cost, is also environmentally friendly, gives an alternate mode for people to move their goods and also for the passenger transportation. So that's what my view is on your first question. I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Now, before I open the floor for discussion, we have already started receiving a number of questions through this Slido app. And before I come to those questions, let me go back to a very important point that Julian has made in his remarks, that we have plans, we have policies, we have regulations. So how are we going to have better alignment between all these things? Do you see that is happening in India or in Sri Lanka? I mean, we can particularly talking about these two countries because we have representatives from India and Sri Lanka in the panel. That alignment of plans, policies, and regulations. That's very important. Number one. Number two, do you see that we have this body called South Asian Forum for Infrastructure Regulators. They're primarily for electricity regulators. Now, for waterways, do you see that it will be good to have such a body to informally at least exchange information, knowledge, good practices, not so good practices, so that one can learn from each other experience and then apply those learning in their own work. So anybody would like, Julian, would you like to take on this, or Ellen?
I have a comment, but why doesn't Julian go first? Yesterday, Duncan Overfield said that there was a 25-year strategic plan that was needed. That idea wasn't picked up, but in my experience with strategic planning, people kind of shut down. They don't want to sort of think that far ahead, but it's essential given the nature of what is needed in South Asia to think that far ahead. A plan, and I'm getting at your question, people, the plan has to have hard deadlines, it has to have metrics, it has to have a feedback loop. And above all, it has to involve all of the littoral states of the Bay of Bengal, plus Bhutan and Nepal. We're talking here about 12,000 kilometers of coastline, of which India is 7,000, plus the origin of some of the greatest rivers in the world. The point that Duncan Overfield made in passing was it has to be comprehensive. And that includes not just the issues immediately surrounding maritime and inland water connectivity, but things like urbanization, where people are going to move if these ports and rivers are developed. How can you assure potable water and sewage for those people? That's just one tiny piece of looking comprehensively. What you would need then is working groups that meet regularly among these countries cross-border in these particular areas and incorporating them into this plan. It's very, very difficult because it's so comprehensive. Everybody wants the same thing. You want to erase the imaginary line down the middle of the bay. You want to have a bridge between South Asia, Southeast Asia. You want to bring back the historical vitality that you mentioned. And for inland waterways, you want the management that facilitates trade and transport while also protecting fisheries and the environment and livelihoods, right? Each of these things is enormously complicated. So it's really going to take a very long time. And then finally, you have the human resource gap that several people have identified, the lack of people who are really, really skilled in PPPs and in planning these things. And that takes a very long-term investment in education because there's a real gap there. So that's an example of, I think, how you would begin to approach it. You take the vision, the objective, you work out a strategy, and then the tactics to achieve the strategy in nitty-gritty detail, but all on a cross-national basis and all involving the private sector from day one.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for highlighting this point. Okay.
Julian will tell me what's possible.
Julian?
What's realistic. I'm a dreamer.
No, I don't think so. I think it's quite hard to add much after that eloquence. I too picked up on the observation made by Duncan yesterday that there needs to be some sort of regional plan. I have to say I'm not always a great fan of these things because before you know where you are, you end up with a sort of huge planning department and centralized planning and all that. And that's a nightmare. Getting the balance between making sure that everybody knows what they're doing and somehow making the whole thing sort of atrophy is very difficult. But I really do think that it needs to be done. And a case in point is what's going on at the top end of the Bay of Bengal. There are a whole load of port projects being talked about, some in Bangladesh, some in Myanmar, some in the sort of top end of India. But they're all being talked about in isolation. And that's just a recipe for disaster. So we need to develop a framework. But to go back to the question, how do we make all this come together? It strikes me there are one or two other elements, and obviously one of them is having a plan. Two, all this has got to be high on the policy agenda. Somehow, and perhaps it's through more fora like this, we have to make sure that people at the highest level understand the economic prize that can be secured if connectivity is improved. I mean, the recent World Bank exercise, which demonstrates how much economic worth can be got from cross-border trade. And let's not forget, this region is the least connected of any region anywhere in the world. As Maersk, we run regional container operators in Asia, in Europe, around the Caribbean, but we don't do it here at all. And the reason is because it just doesn't make sense. There isn't the business. So policymakers need to get this high on the agenda. There needs to be more involvement of business, but business need to see that they're going to get something from it. At the end of the day, it's all about making money. projects have to be bankable. There has to be a sensible balance of risk and reward. We're not looking for a place in the sun. We're just looking for something which is a fair thing. And the last point I'd make is that I hope from this that people can be encouraged to think sideways about things. And a case in point is the way in which we keep restricting ourselves. As container volumes into and out of India grow, they will increasingly be impeded by the fact that there are growing imbalances. It's already been mentioned just now in respect of Bangladesh. You end up with more boxes going in than you've got going out, or the other way around. In other parts of the world, what we and the container industry as a whole can do is use those boxes for domestic purposes. That's very difficult here. And when I say domestic, I mean domestic within the region. That's well nigh impossible here. We have to break down those rules. But to do that, that means that policymakers do have to think sideways when they make policy decisions. What are the unlooked for consequences of what I'm doing, and what else is there that needs to be taken into account? Which I know is a very open-ended observation, but we need to try and break down all this silo stuff. And as I said, a conference like this, which engages all the stakeholders, I think is a good step forward.
Thank you, Julian. So now let us take a few questions. I mean, first of all, yes, Tapas. You want to add to this?
Yes, I want to. The development deficit in this region is a dampener and an opportunity also for a kind of regional plan or strategic plan. I think the dampener is that the economy is going to grow at substantial pace anyway. 6-7% India, Bangladesh, near about similar per capita income. For foreseeable future, 6-7% it will grow, and therefore there will be additional movement in the economy, additional demand for logistics, and as long as the private sector and the government together can show that they are able to satisfy the infrastructure need for part of the domestic demand, so there would be satisfaction at some level. So it's easy in one way. The opportunity for getting things done in a regional way and for integrated way is also the development deficit. For example, IWI has calculated now that the infrastructure they are creating, to run this infrastructure and run the businesses, minimum businesses in this infrastructure, we need 134,000 new skilled people at different levels of skilling, from National Waterway 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, not 100 waterways, only number 1 to 5. The requirement is 134,000 new skilled people in this country, which does not exist. Now, maybe that is something, whether educationally qualified or not, Bangladesh, because they have some 6.7 million people who are involved in the inland waterway business. Now, compared to that, India probably has less than 5,000. So that's an area that actually that development deficit can actually be an opportunity to integrate. So just wanted to make those points.
Thank you. I think this was a very important point. All this flanking matters. So essentially the issue is that we have to look at it holistically, and as holistically as possible, so that all this flanking matters. We don't have skilled people, even in a country like India, with a huge population, as he has just pointed out, that we don't have enough people, skilled people, to run this business. And possibly we can import such people from Bangladesh. I mean, that is one source, immediate source that we have. So let us take a few questions. We already have some of them in Slido. So first is, what kind of infrastructure investment is required to promote the usage of inland waterways for trade and transit within and among countries in the region? So Vishal, would you like to address this?
So that's an interesting question. I believe someone from the trade side, from the private sector, has asked this question. So I partly addressed this question in my comments few minutes back, that the development which is already going on, and much of it is going on River Ganga right now. The terminals and the location for those terminals have been identified with a thorough exercise, that what is the need of the trade, which commodities are present geographically, and what are the current challenges with the current mode of transportation in those geographies, that a terminal like this coming up on waterways can ease off the challenges that the trade is facing. So just giving you a few names of the multimodal terminals that are being planned on Ganga, which is Varanasi, you have Sahibganj, and then you have Haldia. Now all three locations have come up with intent of serving specific geographies and certain commodities. You can find out those details on the website also. I won't go into the details right now. But this is the thought process with which the development is being done. And when this type of development gets replicated across Brahmaputra, which is the next line, on which operations are already on, and the other viable waterways across India, you will start realizing that these terminals have become the centers for business growth and the industrial growth in that geography. Also, to add on, this is not being done just with an intent of developing growth in India. Wherever there is a possibility of doing the connectivity to the neighboring countries which are landlocked, let's say Nepal and even Bhutan to some extent, even those countries, the trade will get promoted because they're getting a connectivity which till now was a challenge for them. So that's where I see the growth is being done with that thought process in mind.
Thank you, Vishal. Let me add to what you have said, because I spent a substantial part of my life on the bank of that river, right? And I have seen the state of that river, how it was 40 years ago, and how it is now. Well, all these terminals, multimodal terminals, which you are talking about, they are important. I have no doubt on them. But that navigability is also very, very important. That requires substantial, significant amount of dredging. Yes. That's number one. So my question is, do we have enough dredging machines, the modern dredging machines, number one? And number two is, when we are getting those silt out through dredging, where are we putting them? I understand that the company, they create another channel and put them there. So it's putting the issue or the trouble or the problem under the carpet, right? My point is not that. My point is, in that case, when you require huge amount of modern dredging machines, I understand there is already a good big company which has invested a lot in Bangladesh, Ellicott Dredgers. It's an American company. So are you ready to import those machines from Bangladesh or from other countries?
Sure. So good that you raised that point. I should have spoken about it during conversing. When this development plan is going on, there is also a very strong thought process that the end-to-end depth availability should be present across the year. And that is where the private sector is being involved. In one such contract for dredging, a very big name has been identified through a tendering process, and a stretch of river has been given on tender to achieve the depth in that stretch and to also maintain the channel in which the navigation will happen. They have to achieve that and they have to maintain that. Okay. Otherwise, if they don't do it, there are severe penalty clauses also associated with that. So, in this example, what is happening is you are bringing on board a private sector party who is experienced in doing this work. Okay, and that is how the things are getting achieved. In another model, IWI may consider purchasing or getting such dredgers on lease. They already have small departmental dredgers in place, okay, but they're not capable of doing such a heavy dredging. Okay, but that option also exists. Okay, So both private sector participation and your own dredgers capable of doing dredging on the rivers, both the options are open, and one of them has already been implemented.
Thank you, Vishal. Yes.
I think because we are involved in projects in both Bangladesh and India, I need to talk about this dredging issue a bit. There is a lot of talk going about the enormous scale of dredging, etc., etc. Now, the intent of this inland fairway maintenance is not actually dredging. We really do not concentrate on dredging. Dredging is not the focus. What is needed is maintaining a fairway within depth that is acceptable to commercial operators. Now, that depth sometimes is available. For example, between Triveni and Haldia, the depth is always more than 3 meters. There is no need to dredge that part.
Throughout the year?
Throughout the year.
I am not very sure about it. I go there every year, though I don't stay in that area.
Yeah, but the question is not the river. Question is the fairway. The river Ganga is 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer wide in places. What is needed for inland waterway, the best possible scenario is 60-meter wide channel, which is fairway, where 2 vessels can pass without collision. So which is the size of the ship lock in Farakka, the 2 ship locks in Farakka together? Is that the width you require? And you don't require to dredge the entire river. Same in Dhaka-Chittagong waterway that we are helping them to maintain. So the job is to maintain the fairway. Now in that fairway, once in a while shoals will come up. That needs to be displaced. That dredge material does not need to be displaced outside the river. Whatever is in the river remains in the river, number one. Second, the methodology that would be used, most of the places is water injection method for dredging, not cutting, cutting and sucking. So water injection means that, we actually displace the minimum that is required and we displace in location. At any case, in Inland Water Authority of India has debarred any displacement of dredge material for more than 200 meter laterally and more than 500 meter longitudinally. So there is, these contracts are specific that nobody is taking any dredge material out of the river and taking it more than 200 meter from that location, which is also in the river, because the flow zone of Ganga is nowhere less than 1 kilometer. Okay. Now, in Bangladesh, there is another issue. Bangladesh dredging is a must in many places because Bangladesh had navigable waterways which have actually sedimented tremendously. So Bangladesh government has a program of dredging. They are intent on dredging because the dredging is seen also to be a good protection of agricultural area. Because by dredging, they are trying to create riverside land which are then a caution against eroded land from flooding. So that's two different idea. India does not have that idea yet. Now, third issue is that the contracts are maintenance contracts. It's not about dredging contracts. You are not getting paid for the amount of dredged material. So more you dredge, you get paid is the conventional method. Here, that's not the method. It's about maintenance dredging. If you maintain, you get paid. If you maintain with least dredging, you are benefited. The private sector, why would they try to dredge more if they are getting paid for maintaining? Fourth, many places in India, for example, Varanasi and around, their LAD, least available depth, is not more than 1.8 meters. Now, between Sahibganj and Barauni and upstream, it's about 2.5 meters. Now, the government intends to get low draft vessels. So these are 10 designs of these are already in public domain. IWI has actually prepared the designs and given it out in the public domain for the private sector to take up these designs and manufacture according to those designs. There are manufacturing which has also started of some. So these vessels should not require more than 2 meters of depth.
And what
That's
is the
another
possibility
solution.
of foreign direct investment in
Lots
this manufacturing?
happening,
Yeah?
happening,
Okay.
and should happen more and more.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for this clarification. Now, let me come to Sugeeswara. There is a specific question for you, which says, are Sri Lanka's maritime investment initiatives Indo-Pacific oriented? I would add Indo-Pacific oriented or not?
Well, not only Indo-Pacific, it's global oriented. See, Indian Ocean is a global trade lifeline. As I mentioned earlier, we handle transshipments in Sri Lanka for India, 80% of them for India, the transshipment of containers. Now, in addition to that, we do handle, we are developing these ports for global trade. Japan is very much interested, and South Korea. It is west to east as well as east to west trade. I'll mention about Japan. When we talk about connectivity, Japan is very much interested, and they have been investing in not only Sri Lanka, South Asia for facilitating and expanding, developing connectivity. See, they have also invested heavily in one of our harbors, one of our terminals in Colombo. Then China's interest is China has taken over the management of one of our harbors, ports, which is the closest one to the international sea lane. So this is not merely for Asia Pacific oriented. It's a global trade facilitation. So as we are strategically situated close to this sea lane, so we would like to take the maximum advantage of that. And these deals are purely, I must mention again, the commercial deals. There are no other hidden agendas in this. So we ask for bids and give to the best deal we go in for. As an island nation, I think we have to depend on the ocean resources for development. And we are an agriculture-based country, and we hardly produce any export products. Because of that, we are heavily dependent on, earlier we were heavily dependent on the traditional agriculture products like tea, rubber, coconut, cocoa, and so on. But now the prices have dropped, and with the turn of events, those we can not depend on those. Then we went in for industrialization with introduction of garment factories. That also collapsed after some time, although they are one of the, currently it is the third largest foreign exchange earner for the country, but still it is not. So we are depending on making it, once we get into the international trade as a facilitator, it is not Asia Pacific only, it is for the global trade, and we facilitate any country. The Korea is very much interested. They are coming in for a heavy LNG plant, offshore LNG refueling facilities. Then Japan also interested in similar project. So this is a global thing rather than limiting to Asia Pacific.
Thank you. Now we have specific questions for specific persons. There is one for Ellen, one for Vishal, and there is one for Julian. Let me first come to Julian. Your question is, as a representative of a multilateral business, what are the governance challenges experienced or envisaged by you in the region? But I know that you have more than 20 years of experience in this region, and you can talk about this subject for the next 365 days. But you have less than 365 seconds to answer this question.
Thank you. Don't worry, I won't talk about it for 365 days. Clearly, in the logistics industry, in a part of the world where logistics is a young subject, governance in the broadest sense of the word and the regulatory environment is a problem because the environment is immature. There was a very eloquent finance chap speaking earlier this morning, Bill, I think his name was, anyway, who made reference to the fact that there are lots of parts of the world that have trouble getting their heads around the complications of all these subjects. So clearly there is an issue. How do we get around it? The answer is two things, I think. One is continuing dialogue, and this is a part of it. And that is not, hopefully, just a set of words. It's a responsibility, and people have to take that on board. And that involves everybody. The second part of it is clarity of policy purpose, which has to be communicated and understood by everybody. If the policy keeps changing, then the rules keep changing, there's confusion, and people and issues slip through the cracks.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
That's all I can say at the moment, within my 365 seconds.
Thank you. Ellen, the question for you, what are US business interests in maritime and waterways in the South Asian region?
There's a huge population, and maritime and river improvement is a way of developing a great, huge market, ultimately. But right now, partly for reasons of governance and partly for reasons of protectionism, that potential is not being filled, and so U.S. business is not investing the way we would all like to see. That leads me to one of two quick points. We haven't talked in this conference at all about the centrality of domestic market-oriented economic reform combined with trade and investment liberalization. If you think of the reasons why trade, globalization, and so on has expanded so much in the post-war era, it is because of that combination of domestic reform and trade and investment liberalization. And so that's an area where South Asia needs very much to improve. India's reputation in particular, even among Southeast Asians who are no wild-eyed free traders, is not very good because of all the loopholes and exceptions. And we all want to see this wonderful vision developing without paying the domestic political cost. But in fact, you have to pay a domestic political cost. And that leads me to my second quick point, best illustrated by an anecdote. In the first Bill Clinton administration, I worked in the trade office. The trade representative was Mickey Cantor, who was Bill Clinton's campaign manager and a very political individual. He went to Seattle and made a speech about how Clinton was promoting exports and how export industries pay more than the average, and it was all exports, exports, exports. And then finally someone raised their hand and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Cantor, this is the port of Seattle. We have stevedores and truckers and retail agents and insurance agents, all dependent on imports. And when you add to that the role that imports have played in keeping inflation down and in helping poor people buy clothing, you can see the tremendous contribution of imports. But it's a political fact of life that the jobs actually or allegedly lost to import competition are much more visible than the jobs gained through imports. So the point I want to make is that it's so important as we look ahead to build constituencies, new constituencies, not just the private sector, but young people, local communities, involving the state and local authorities from the beginning, so that we can, and educating the public on why it is that we're trying to pursue all of these goals. And if you neglect that, it comes back to bite you as you go forward.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for making this very important point, that imports are equally important when we talk about trade. Now, I'll come to the floor in about 2-3 minutes, but before that, there is a very interesting question for Vishal. And Vishal, what kind of logistic preparation does Nepal require to participate in the waterway sector in the region? Vishal, very briefly, because we have already run out of time.
Sure.
We started 10 minutes late.
Yeah. So already there is a good amount of dialogue happening between India and Nepal at the government level regarding which areas the best practices can be exchanged. Since Inland Waterways Authority of India has already been into this work taking things on the ground. One area of cooperation which has been identified is helping the Nepalese government and the concerned bodies in developing their own waterways, the technical side of it and the operational side of it. That is one area. Second is this river route, which is being proposed for movement of Nepalese goods, it is still not part of the treaty which exists between Nepal and India. Road exists, rail exists, but waterways has been proposed and is already under the consideration of ministry for inclusion. So once that happens, things will start happening on the ground. And which is where the readiness from both the sides will be required. Your trade will shift. The trade which is right now happening from Haldia and Calcutta, that trade will now shift to locations which are the upcoming terminals on this river and the border exchange points. So preparation on that front also will be required in terms of the customs, in terms of the logistics, equipments and the infrastructure which is required for the end-to-end movement. So these are broadly are the areas wherein the preparedness from both Nepalese and the Indian side would be expected.
Thank you, Vishal. I saw Sathu's hand and Abhishek's hand, so I'll take few questions. But before that, we just have about 5 to 7 minutes to wrap up this session. I have one question for Mr. Paul. Do you think that in near future, by near future I mean over in the next 3 to 5 years, is it possible to have river cruise from Calcutta to Dhaka via Rajshahi, from Dhaka to Guwahati in Meghna and up to Dibrugarh? I guess Jannavi would also be interested in raising that question.
Yeah, as per the decision taken on 24th of October, this is going to happen in about 2-3 months, not 2-3 years. Now, you put a interesting twist, Calcutta to Dhaka through Rajshahi. Now, that's also another thing to think about, because India has now agreed to finance 80% of the dredging cost of the Rajshahi channel. But the major problem is the Jangipur lock. So the lock was created along with the Farakka barrage. In 1975, the work was completed, but it was not operated even for a day. And of course, I mean, that capacity is not sufficient now. So along with the additional lock which is being created in Farakka right now, the work is started. Work has started. I think, I mean, next job is to get a lock in Jangipur. And
so first we have to break it and then...
Or some other alternative location nearby.
Vishal, you want to add very quickly?
There is one more significant part of it, which is that this Rajshahi route is also participant in the water sharing treaty which exists between India and Bangladesh. So it is, we can't see this movement happening just in isolation. It will have to be taken up at the right level so that the water sharing treaty also gets addressed in the opening up of this new route.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, Satu.
Yeah, yes, Satu Levay from the East West Center. Thank you for thank you for a great panel. My question is, I think Julian mentioned, if I got the phrase right, there just isn't the business. But our friend Vishal from PwC suggested there's lots of business. You may be talking about different things in terms of the business climate, but I'm trying to get an assessment just in my head of how much is business spurring this inland waterway connectivity? I mean, is there a rough percentage that one can think about roads, rails, and waterways now in the context of the domestic economy here? And just a small, you talked about lack of human capacity, 134,000 workers would be needed, et cetera. I was just trying to get a handle for myself on the vessels that would be required for inland waterways. Does India have the shipbuilding potential to create all the vessels that it requires? Does it have an import plan? Because I've been looking at more on the defense side of the house in terms of vessel production from shipbuilding facilities here, and just wanted to try to better understand that. Thank you.
So let us take a few questions together so that we can save on time. Abhishek? ऑन करके रखिए.
Yeah, very quick question. So one thing that's clear from the discussion so far is that we need to really link demand with connectivity. Now, what is the play and understanding of that play at the country level to creating demand? And that refers to the question of e-commerce and digital connectivity. And what are the projections, if there are? What kind of increase in trade could digital connectivity through e-commerce create, and could make some of the projects more viable than they currently are? My second sharp question is, well, we spoke a little bit about BRI, and I think the elephant in the room is the projects need to be sustainable, and they need to be financially sustainable also. So the critical thing to make them financially sustainable would be the parameter of quality. And somebody spoke about PQI, Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. The challenge there is that when you do speak of quality, it appears that it will probably fail to address the question of scale and speed. So the alternative to scale and speed would come essentially from not just one country initiative, but probably would come from a kind of coalition, a multi-alignment. And how do you address that specific question of meeting scale and speed when the alternative is probably investments that are not really feasible?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Bilwas.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's not my question. It's just supplement information what Vishal has said. Actually, I'm part of the team from Nepal. Actually, the team leader from Nepalese side, having dialogue with Indian counterparts. So. Actually, we already had 2 meetings. We had also visit to Banaras and Kolkata to see the infrastructures being developed by India in Ganges River. At the same time, we are also having discussion how we can make our rivers navigable in particularly the stretch in India. And once it enters to Nepal, and then we'll probably have to build some our own infrastructures. Actually, this dialogue of inland waterway has been recently developed in Nepal, after being, I would say, being excited by the way India is going to develop inland waterway in Ganges rivers. So without this, it was almost impossible to have inland waterway in Nepal. That is why this. Actually, we are really in confusion. What sort of infrastructure will be required in the future. To make it more, optional to the traders, commerce people, for inland and roads, railways, connectivity. These sort of things are still, our whole plans are going to be changed actually. We never thought of inland waterway just 6 months before much. After this joint visit of, our visit of our Prime Minister to India, they had the joint statement which mentions that the trade and transit treaty will include the inland waterway. So this is how this dialogue has come into the picture, and then aggressively we are working on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm sorry that I'm unable to take any more questions. We are already 15 minutes, though we started 10 minutes late. So I would give the opportunity to respond to these questions. So first starting with Vishal, 1 minute each to each of you. Yeah, Vishal.
I'll take a couple of questions the gentleman in front of me raised. Right now, as we are sitting, inland waterways across different states in India is moving cargo to the tune of 55 million tons per annum. Okay, so this includes your rivers which are being developed. These are rivers which are on the coastal route, wherein you have the import and export cargo from the mainland coastal ports using rivers to reach the hinterland. Okay, so that is the number we are talking about. And once the development goes through and your terminals are up and running, okay, and your fairway is navigable, okay, these numbers are bound to grow by leaps and bounds. So that's on the cargo front. The second question was about the vessel designs. Now these
and just availability.
Yeah, availability too. Yes. So In terms of vessel design, these vessel designs that we were referring to have been designed by a specialized firm called DST based out of Germany. Okay, and these designs are for different kind of cargoes which are dealing with break bulk, you have ro-ro vessels, you have car carriers, you have vessels for liquid bulk. Okay, so different kind of vessels targeting different commodities. And as Mr. Paul mentioned, that these vessel designs are in the public domain for the vessel manufacturers to refer to and build their own vessels through the laid out process. In terms of current availability of vessels, yes, that is a challenge. India doesn't have much, a good quantity of barges or vessels which can ply on these waterways. But that is where I believe an opportunity exists for the private sector to pitch in. Okay, both in terms of owning vessels and establishing the vessel building, vessel construction facilities. There are few facilities based in the eastern region, Calcutta area, but I believe with the kind of volumes we are expecting running on waterways, I don't think they are going to last as sufficient.
Tapas, very quickly.
I would talk about this issue about quality versus time, and of course the question is much deeper. I'll just talk about inland waterway. So when in Bangladesh and India both we started discussing, the idea was that we discussed is that India and Bangladesh are probably starting 50 years too late. Now, if you are starting 50 years too late, would you start with 50-year-old technology, or you will start with today's technology? So that part is also aspirational. India is creating this infrastructure, has to be world-class infrastructure. So just a thought on these vessels. These would be the vessels which are zero-discharge vessels. Nowhere in the world, this kind of vessels are plying at mass scale. So zero-discharge vessels and with LNG fuel, etc., etc. So these are things which are part of the aspiration, and the terminal buildings, etc., are being constructed. On 11th, the first work will be inaugurated. So on 12th, you can go to Varanasi and see whether what India claims that they are creating something world-class is true or not. So on 12th of November.
Good. Thank you. Julian, very quickly.
In answer to the specific question about is there the demand, I was talking about the container markets where demonstrably there isn't. But that can change, and it is already changing in India because India has made a policy move of getting rid of the cabotage legislation, which is immensely constructive. But if we went a step further and started looking at that cabotage legislation and other associated legislation, not just in terms of India, but of Bangladesh and Myanmar and Sri Lanka, then that demand could arise. In answer to a point that was made over here about supply and demand, clearly building capacity, if there ain't the demand at all, it requires a considerable sense of humour. But the name of the game in infrastructure is to build ahead of demand, because it does attract business. And that's a conundrum which Sri Lanka now is in a real jam over, because they've run out of container capacity in Colombo. So it's a very difficult balance, and there isn't a quick answer. But to say you only build infrastructure when the demand is clear is, I believe, taking too narrow a view.
So supply will create its own demand. Anyway, Ellen?
In response to
very
the
quickly.
comment about short-term demand and quality in China, China is getting a certain amount of pushback, and I'm encouraged by the AIIB, and particularly by the leadership of Jin Lichung, who wants to meet quality standards and earn a AAA rating like the ADB. So I think China's getting the lesson about that. You can't skimp on quality, not in a business like this.
Thank you.
Sri Lanka too is interested in shipbuilding. That's one area we are planning to go into, because it needs heavy capital, and we are seeking for investments. At the moment, Colombo Dockyard builds yachts and cruiser ships. But we don't have enough capacity for that. But with the expansion of few ports in Sri Lanka, we are thinking of going into shipbuilding, and that's an area where the foreign investments are expected. And before I conclude, I would like to thank CUTS International, East West, and FICCI and other partners of this for inviting me and the excellent hospitality provided. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, we have come to an end of this session. So let me first thank the panelists. I think the discussion, I don't know, we need your feedback on the discussion, whether it was good, bad, or worse, or ugly, whatever they are. And let me also thank all of you for your participation. So now let me request my colleague, Debolina, to conclude this session.
Thank you all the panelists. May I please request Mr. Bipul Chatterjee to honor the panelists with a Grow Tree certificate for coming into the panel. We'll break for lunch now, which is being served at the Rani Bagh lawn. We'll have a session on border security from 1:30. So please be here at 1:30. Three parallel tracks. So in this room, yeah.
So we're going to start at 1:30. We're going to have lunch in Rani Bagh lawn. So I request all of you to be back in whatever sessions that you are going to attend at 1:30. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.